Tak dobrý den, já vás všechny vítám na přednášce Herwiga Turka, který bude mít přednášku o tom, že jsem to posílala někomu rozšiřující informace, doufám, že se dostane všem, o tom, čím se zabývá. A zkráceně je to člověk, který pracuje s přesahem umění do vědy. A tak já mu předám slovo a prosím, přemýšlejte nad diskuzí. Chtěli bychom od vás nějaké otázky potom. Jo? A bude to v angličtině, doufám, že vám to
Okay. Good morning. I hope my English will be understandable. I'm really glad to be here and thank you for showing up and so many people. Probably you have to, I'm not sure. If you have any questions, if you don't understand my English, if you don't understand what I'm explaining, just interrupt me and we go into a discussion. The talk will be about 1 hour, more or less. There will be videos, also sound, and I will talk freely so we can always interact. Just to give you an idea, I was studying in Vienna in the 80s, and then I built an association with friends for art and new technologies. I did a project with an inclination group about forgetting. It was an interdisciplinary project that actually also was visiting Brno. I don't know exactly, I think 96 or 97 in Dumini and in the inner city part. Then I moved to Portugal and there I met molecular biologist Paulo Pereira, who's working in Coimbra. And we were starting to discuss and work on projects together that were kind of in between art and science. Of course, me as the artist, I would always be the director more or less of the artistic outcome, but he would really give his input, what he thinks is valuable also for the science part, what is interesting for him as a person. And so it was a mixture. And then I finally got artist in residence, got into an artist in residence program at the Institute of Molecular Medicine in Lisbon, where I had access to the laboratories there for 2.5 years. And what I forgot, since 1 year, I'm teaching again on the University of Applied Arts in Vienna, so I came back actually to the place where I studied. And I start with some older works to show you that there was, thank you very much, that there was kind of a connection between, I don't know, my beginnings and then what came out like in the last 10 years. These are very simple black and white images. It was in '93 where I realized that like in body parts there's a certain information about organs, and if you mirror them, you get kind of into a confusing situation where the observer actually projects a lot into it. So these pictures, they are pretty big. They are bigger than they are projected now. Were really disturbing for a few people that went into the exhibitions, that they got like really, frightened by them. They hardly could stand it. But it was very individual, depending on probably how you deal with your body or how you interpret and project your own fears into it. Then I had the possibility to actually show a piece in an operation area of a hospital in Carinthia. At that point, the operation area was not functioning any longer, even though technically it was fully intact, but they reorganized the whole operation areas that they had. And you have to imagine that you're like really going into a hospital, and then you go to the operation area where you usually never enter. And then you are like in a very cold room because we put down the temperature, and then you have these sliding doors that lock you in, and then you come into the operation area, and it's not very well projected actually, but what you see like here in the front, these are fish fingers, like fish sticks. And they are like built to this monolithic block, and they are in the deep freeze island, and it matches perfectly into the operation area aesthetics. And I had like images up there, like super organs, and there was a wave. And what was interesting for me was that you could not tell where the art starts and where the technical infrastructure ends. And it mostly all these red, yellow lines that you see, these were quotes out of the internet about cryonics. Cryonics is the technique that is a bit, I don't know, it was very popular in the 90s, and I don't know if it's still a topic, but it means that you freeze your body when you die, and you eventually can reanimate it and later on. So it's stored away in a deep freeze venue, but of course, like the first bodies that were frozen, they got a total cell damage, so it's most unlikely that they will be, how do you say, reanimated at any point, you know. But in general, the real concept is that you also treat your body as like material, you store it, and then you get it out like 50, 100 years later, but all your social texture is totally disappeared, and you don't even know how old are you when you are reanimated. You know? So this was a topic that was interesting for me at that time. This is a quote of a philosopher from Vienna, and I think it's really important what he says, that you never know where actually the act of seeing starts and where it ends, you know, where the organ is actually receiving something, and where your brain actually projects into the images that you receive, because you have such a history and you have such a cultural background, how you look at things, that it's most unlikely that you would survive in the jungle, for instance, because you can't read it, you know. Vice versa, of course, people that are not used to big cities, if they go to New York, they can be run over easily. What was interesting for me was to investigate if descriptive perception and constructive perception, you know, like to have the analysis of the situation, like kind of neutral, which the nature science, for instance, should be, versus projection of your beliefs into a situation, would also work in scientific environments. And I did a series of pictures. They are called referenceless photography, and I called it like referenceless photography because I used, if you're familiar with the program Photoshop, Adobe Photoshop, you can open a canvas, you know, you have a white rectangle, and then I applied filters and filters and filters on top of this until some structures appeared, you know. When the structures were that complex that I had the feeling, okay, this is connected to kind of technical images like microscopy or satellite images or X-rays or stuff like that, then I would interrupt it and leave it there. And I did not know exactly what I would do with it. I was fascinated that there's really no reference behind it, no object, it's just algorithms. But then with Paulo Pereira, who is actually a scientist who works in vision science, we did send out the materials to experts worldwide that are also working in microscopy and in ophthalmology, and they would interpret what they actually see there. This guy, for instance, Guy Fransen from the Netherlands Ophthalmic Research Institute, he is like one of the, how do you say, like the big names there. And he was really challenged by the concept that he would now interpret this image, and he would tell, okay, this is a whalefish eye, it was cut 4 times and then dried out, and then it was read by this and this microscope. And he was totally convinced that he figured out what it is. But the funny thing was that, of course, it was just Photoshop filters, you know, and he would believe that these are proteins and I don't know what, because he knew that, of course, Paulo was working in this area, and I mean it was very similar in a certain extent in the aesthetic, but we also got sent back from a scientist that this image is very similar to this one. This one he sent back, you know, it reminds him, and like from a morphological standpoint, it's totally different. You know, I think it doesn't have any real connection to it. So it was not about making fun of the scientists, but it was more to prove that they are totally influenced by the environment, of course, by the references where the images are embedded. And this is a case that's very interesting. Dan Shechtman, he won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 2011, and he found 10 years earlier in crystals a structure that was not readable with the normal structures, with the standardized structures that crystals have. And he called it quasi-crystals. And this irregularity was obviously visible in the microscope, but all his colleagues said it can't be. I don't see it. This is wrong, you know, because it didn't fit in the system. And it took him 10 years to prove that it actually exists, and when he could convince the scientific community, he got the Nobel Prize. And it's like how is it called? Sorry, a medical scientist from Poland actually in the beginning of the century wrote a book where he was writing about events in immunology, I can't pronounce it today, where diseases were very often badly treated because the belief was it could not be like this. Like for instance, infectious diseases, he did not find out for quite some time that it's connected to their experiments with dead bodies, that actually many people then got sick in the hospitals, you know, because the doctors did not understand that they would transmit actually the infection by working on dead bodies and then on patients, and the hygiene was established just later. And he said that there is a harmony of illusion also in the scientific community. So if like the main institutions like the British Academy says this is what science knows and this is what science says, or Nature, now the Nature magazine, it's very influential also on what you perceive as scientists today. Okay, that was a long excursion. These are examples where I showed it in South Korea at the Media Biennial, or this was in Vienna, quite recent show, where they are presented in light boxes, which also suggest that it's like X-rays or technical images. And then I continued to work with Paulo Pereira, and we went into the laboratories, and we asked scientists to actually reproduce a proceeding that she does every day. It's like the Western blot, it's called. It means that you are preparing a gene sequence. You need to prepare a gel, and there are some certain steps how you do that. And what we asked her to do is to do this preparation of the experiment as she does it every day, but without the objects. Because usually the body of the scientist is quite invisible. It's like a tool, you know. It's covered by the proceedings. It's embedded in a how do you say? It's also a functional unit as the objects are. And what was interesting for me is to show actually the gestures, these like motoric events, which actually have also kind of a knowledge. You know, they are really very well trained. They can do it actually with closed eyes, I think. And she managed to reproduce the whole thing 4 times, and she did probably 1 or 2 little mistakes, but the rest was really perfect. And then we put one layer on top of the other layer. And what we have now is kind of a documentation of a technique that probably in 5 or 10 years will not exist as it is, and then it's hard to read. But right now, everybody who's working in molecular biology would immediately understand what she is doing and what the method is. And so I think it's also a nice kind of time-based piece that will change throughout the years and then be kind of a choreographic piece later on. And what I really liked was that even though the objects are absent, they are very present. You know, if you get an idea that there is a pipette involved. I mean, of course, for you it's probably very abstract because you might not have been in a molecular medicine laboratory, but for scientists or people that work also in connection to the labs, these objects are super present. Okay, let's keep that. Then I did the second version, where I actually used aesthetic. Wait, sorry. At that experiment, it's again the Western blot, but I put a camera in front of the scientist and on top of the scientist. I put also this grid to make it more scientific, more measurable, and give the aesthetic of that actually the scientist is in an experiment, which he in fact was. And there are many videos, scientific videos about behavioral events with flies, with fish, with other test animals, where they kind of record what they are doing and measure what they are doing, also like in time and space. And so I was suggesting that I'm measuring now, like pretty precise, what they are doing to kind of get a recording. So the language in the video changed very much, even though like the same proceedings were shown. And this is for me an important artistic decision. You know, how you present it. If you have it like this, you know, you get a very different look at the things than if you superimpose it. Of course, this is more poetic, but that's the second version. And then I invited scientists into a lab at the Institute of Molecular Medicine. When I was there, artist in residence, I had one teaching lab for me. And there I would build up a scenario that would remind the scientists again of a lab situation. I had all the objects there that they used for the Western blot, but I would then ask them to do different assignments with that. What do you think that I asked them to do?
To measure how heavy it is and to you're collected in some order.
Yeah, exactly. Very good. They expected, of course, that they now would use the objects as they used it every day, and what would be the function of this object, because they could see them just as functional units and not as autonomous objects. And I asked them to order them due to their weight. And so there were two things. First of all, they read the objects totally differently. The first time they were objects that had a weight, that had a form, a material, and things like that, independently of what they were used for. And the second thing was that they kind of had to come up with some body knowledge, again, how to measure things, and you feel that in the videos, actually, also how they developed the methodology to find a way through this task, how they could compare the things. Here you see that she actually composes the object, because it's also what is an object, if it's like a composite object or is it just a plastic and things like that. So these are really tiny shifts in the perception of the everyday work, but for me this was important. And this was the second assignment. It's rather easy to understand what they have to do there. I asked them to build with all the objects that they find the highest tower that they will manage to do. And I mean, now it changed to construction material, But it was also an interesting situation, because I was using them in my experiment, and they were my lab animals somehow. And of course it was not clear who's responsible if the tower collapses, if the equipment is demolished and things like that. And so it was also interesting how they work now in this context. And the girl in the middle, she would actually at some point step out of the experiment. She said it's too risky for her, she stops working on this. She disobeyed, which was part of the game. But even though it's like very playful and kind of like a small shift again in the everyday work, the girl to the left, in the interviews afterwards when I talked to her, she told me that I deformatted her. And this was actually what I wanted to do, that she gets like out of her routines and she gets a new perspective on what she's doing in the lab with the object, with her body. Because you can find, of course, like very individual skills, how you work with this stuff, but you find like some knowledge, I call it tacit knowledge, in these proceedings that is usually never mentioned in the lab reports, or in the scientific experiments. If you have like a really good scientific experiment, in the end you get a report how it was made, but this report is totally fake, because you write it backwards, then that the history is linear. Very often there are coincidences, there are misunderstandings, there's a lot of communication going on in the group, and actually I think the group competence does construct the experiment, and very often knowledge and experience could be intuition, is part of the actual scientific work, but it cannot be mentioned because non-explicit knowledge doesn't exist for nature science. It's not materializing. You can't put it into words, and so this was part of this whole enterprise. Okay, here you see she left already, and she did not build a proper tower. Okay, let's move on. And this is a bit the situation where I asked them in. I have mounted cameras from different angles. They would find it like this, and then people, of course, would organize it differently. There were some accidents, and there were winners. Sorry. I did also recordings from the top, because if they had to establish orders, like for the weight, for instance, or the value of the objects, this was actually a philosophical task, because if you ask somebody, order these objects in terms to their value, you don't even know what is the value. Is it a monetary value? Is it a sentimental value? Is it a functional value? So they would get actually in a struggle, and you could read it very often also out of their proceedings. And what was interesting that in the end, I didn't foresee that, because I said, order them due to this and this. And I always thought there's a linear order or like a repetitive order that will look similar, but it looked totally different. Each scientist did a different order, also like in lines or around in circles. And I think this was a nice small example how also like the individual scientist would solve the task very differently. And one of the latest installations that I did was interviews with scientists. At that point I did invite group leaders, because in science there's also a strong hierarchy, and the group leaders are usually the people that bring together their team, and they say, okay, we are doing the research on this topic and the proceeding should be like this and this, and then the roles are kind of distributed. But the group leader also has to communicate then science to the public and to the politicians to get their fundings and things like that. So this is more a spokesperson and manager of science as well. And I was wondering, because in a one-to-one situation when I met them, I had really interesting conversations. As soon as they were together in a public venue, they would of course not be so outspoken. They would be turned to politicians and marketing instruments and things like that. And then I was thinking, how could I do an interesting conversation in between the group leaders that avoid that they are really tactical, And I came up with an idea, actually with a colleague of mine, performance artist Beatrice Cantino, who helped me as well, to do single interviews with the group leaders in one studio, and then do an installation, a 4-channel video installation, where it looks as if they were sitting in the same room and talking to each other. And
disease is that how much can we get rid completely of the disease, and how much are they part of the equilibrium that is set in the world. For instance, if you think of infectious diseases, there is a big risk of completely eradicating the bug that creates this disease.
But certainly that we are very selective on the things that we remember. So strong experiences of our youth, pleasant, we will never forget. The trivial day-to-day life, probably we will forget very quickly.
No, I would not want to improve my memory. I'm very happy in forgetting things. It's a very nice part of me, and that keeps me alive. Forgetting things is very good.
When I was younger, I had an incredible memory for numbers. I would memorize. One of my hobbies was statistics of athletics, and I would know all single national records for many countries. And nowadays I feel I don't have that capacity anymore, so I would like at least to revert my memory to my 11 years of age memory.
But I guess that we were educated for that, so we are expecting that. It's not a surprise. So I'm ready for that.
The interpretation that we currently have of a given reality might be very different in 300 years. The laws, constant or not, but by definition they should be constant, are still the same. It's just our interpretation that somehow would be different, or we'll look at it in a different angle. The reality would still be the same.
I like to think of science as a search for evidence and not for a maintenance of any kind of belief. Also because to believe in something, you're really not usually thinking of changing your belief. It should be something stable, like believing in God as an image or as a concept. God remains constant, and in science nothing remains constant.
Life sciences is a lot about understanding life without any need to interfere with life itself. Of course, that in order to understand life, it may be necessary to do experiment where you need to isolate basic components of life, like DNA, proteins, to study them. But without a need to change life itself, just the pure satisfaction of understanding how things work.
I think that it depends of what type of nature are we talking about. I think that if we think about physics and chemistry, I think that the laws are constant.
Okay, so this, I will show you a second part of it later on. What was interesting, I think, what I really achieved, or we achieved with this piece, was that the scientists would get out of their lab coats, they would get out of their expertise position, and they would actually be members of the civil society in this very moment, because they were not just in the function of a scientist, as a group leader who is like world known as a scientist, but they were people that were struggling to answer questions like, would you like to be immortal? Are you afraid of disease? Do you want to eradicate disease? And topics that are pretty general, you know. Even though as life scientists they have an expertise on aging, for instance, and they do know, for instance, how to reverse differentiation of cells. So somehow they are really playing with things in this area, but they had to talk as an individual, and they would never have talked in front of each other in this way how they talk to me, because I'm an artist, you know. So they translate and they speak like a very different language, and also we recorded the bodies of them like in this high format, and that you get their body language also involved. You know, if they're explaining something, one thing is what they actually really tell you, you know, but the other thing they tell with their body, you know, feeling unease or being involved and things like that. And this is a second layer of information that for us is very important to judge the person, you know. And they are actually representatives of us because they spend a lot of money to do the research, you know, and they decide what actually they are doing. And I think that's very important for the civil society to understand, you know, what makes scientists going, what kind of people are they, you know, where could I actually raise my voice and say, no, I don't want that you are actually manipulating stem cells, or you're manipulating the genes in the eggs, the fertilized eggs, which they could do technically right now. I mean, that's I just learned a few days ago that by now they have a technique that's called crisping, where they can actually switch off genes, like really one small segment in the DNA, really precisely. So you have like markers for breast cancer or something like that, that you can identify. Theoretically, now if you have a fertilized egg, you could change the DNA there, which sounds marvelous, you know, because then you would not have any risk of breast cancer and so forth, and also it would be inherited, so the next generation would have the same genetic disposition. But no one knows, no one has any idea what this means in 40 years or 50 years, because every gene has various functions, and it's so complex that maybe other problems will appear and then they are inherited. So from an engineer's point, it's very seductive. It's wonderful. Now we can play with all this, how do you say, bricks that build actually our existence. But I mean, of course, for us as a civil society, it's totally important that we are in charge to decide if they can do that or not. So, going back to the 4-channel installation, I will play you a second part where they sit next to each other, and there you can see also how we played the thing that we anticipated that they will be in one room. We positioned one on this side with the lighting and everything. We conducted the interview from one direction so that they would look very often to their colleagues and things like that. And it worked out actually pretty nicely, I think. So, okay, these are installation images, Portugal and in Vienna. Oh, shit. That's wrong.
If you really understand the biological processes that allow a human being to live, then in the end you can try with that knowledge to repair an organism that is not working properly.
Now, concerning medicine, a very important driving force for the development of biomedical research is to treat diseases. But I think the objective is never to achieve immortality, but rather to achieve good quality of life during the years where we are around.
But then if you had really that possibility, you know, there are some things that people ask you and that you don't really know what would be the answer because you are not really faced with that situation. So I don't really know if I would say yes or no, if I really had that chance.
And this desire, immortality, will be always present as far as human beings are living on Earth, and even beyond Earth. One day you get that.
Well, I can't speak for many others, but definitely not in my case. I have no wish to be immortal. I would hate to be immortal, actually. I really think that you can only give any kind of value to life because there is death. Without that as a reference, life is quite meaningless, I think. So for me, it's not an aspiration to become immortal or to help anyone to become immortal.
Life sciences is a lot about understanding life without any need to interfere with life itself. Of course, that in order to understand life, it may be necessary to do experiment where you need to isolate basic components of life, like DNA, proteins, to study them, but without a need to change life itself, just the pure satisfaction of understanding how things work.
There's a song actually now playing in the radio that says you only know that you've been high when you're really low. And so I think without that low of being death, we would never be high of being alive. So long live death.
Well, that's a personal one, but let's put it a bit in the context. It's what everybody wants to do at the moment, right? And that's really what we are trying to do. I mean, we've seen over the past decades an increase in the lifespan. But the big issue at the moment is not the increase of lifespan, it's increasing the lifespan or living that increased lifespan with quality.
Okay. So now probably you have seen the roles that they play very differently, you know, where they try to be very conscious, you know, they're very responsible, but you can always feel also that it's so seductive because they have the tools in their hands, you know, they can go a very different way. And of course, if you talk to them, it's always like, no, we have ethical commissions, you know, we are really careful with it, and it has to be done because you need to cure all the diseases and things like that. In fact, the Human Genome Project, for instance, was financed out of military resources, from the Manhattan Project, which was the building of the atomic bomb, to biological weapon programs, radioactive weapon programs. It continued to the Human Genome Project, and the American military is heavily involved in all the major research institutions, where actually most of the European researchers also have done their PhD, post-PhD studies, or they are called there because they're very prestigious. And so there's a really important conflict of interests. It's not, they're not working for the civil society, that's for sure. If they find treatments for diseases, it's mostly side effects of other things that they are doing. And if you talk to the scientists that are really nice people, I really like them, I admire them because they are so dedicated. They're also fun people, but they're also like working in this machine, and they are not very conscious how far it goes, And I think as a civil society, and as an artist in my case, I have to make I'm not making a stand, but I have to find ways to convey what is actually happening in the laboratories and find a language where I can intervene, where I can say, okay, I don't want that so many billions of dollars are spent for this, do something on renewable energies or research on history or things like that are totally underfinanced, and like life science is totally overfinanced. They get most of the resources right now out of the budgets, the national budgets and the European budgets. But actually now, I reached the end. I was a bit too fast, I'm sorry. But hopefully you have some questions.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Were they angry when they saw your work?
No, not at all.
Did you feel manipulated a little bit?
Yeah, they felt manipulated for sure. But I told them beforehand that I will use the individual interviews to actually produce a conversation that never took place. So this was pretty clear from the beginning. And I mean, they are very self-confident. They are not really questioning themselves too much. They were actually interested and pleased by also to hear a colleague speaking on that level that they never heard, because they would never talk together about these topics, because the topics are also very speculative. You can't really say yes or no. You kind of find a way how you talk about that, and they are avoiding it if they are my colleagues. This is because they have to protect their position and things like that. But it was shown there in Portugal in a very prominent venue. It was like the science pavilion in Lisbon, and many high-ranking scientists were there. And the four of the interviews that were really proud. They were also discussing it, what they think is interesting, also for them. I mean, I think I was especially proud that not just for them it triggered some discussion, but also for people that do not have anything to do with molecular science. They would sit there and really watch the channel installation for half an hour. This looping after half an hour, and they were looking through it. Like the babysitter of my son, for instance, was sitting there, and she never had anything to do with molecular science. So there is a need actually to kind of get into a discussion, I think, with science, and people are in general interested. And usually, if you see scientists, very often they have the lab coat, then they are interviewed, what's your expertise on this? And they explain how the world works, and then there's a cut and TV continues. So that's, we managed to get them out of this role for sure.
Have you ever used science for something very personal or work dealing with a topic very personal for you?
Well, actually, I have to say I forgot to put one piece in it that I did in the beginning, where I actually just used a laboratory, but it was a piece that you would actually just understand with your sense of balance. You know, it was like these shakers that actually shake liquids. I would record it with a camera that was also on a shaker. And so like there was a very strange complex movement in it and you could not really figure out what it was. And then I did on the second channel, I tried to fix it with a post-production program, After Effects, so that it would be stabilized. And this made you really like throw up. So if you were sensitive to that, you stand in front of it, you really got sick a bit. And the weird thing is that hardly anybody understood right away how you actually react on it, you know. And just then you eventually realized that it's your balance sense that helps you to read it. And the complex movement that was not manipulated, it could read without being irritated because it was kind of natural still, or you could predict how it works. And the other one was kind of out of disorder. So this was a direct thing. I mean, if your question goes in the direction, if I would also start to work in the lab as a scientist, so to say.
No, I mean maybe more intimate stuff, which is in contrast with the scientific environment.
Sure, what you mean.
But I think you did it in a way because you bring the topic of immortality or some like personal topics for the scientists to speak. So it's maybe answering the question, because then if everybody has to speak about his mortality like on his own, then it's personal.
Yeah, I mean, for sure I introduced topics to the scientists that were following me for quite some time, because in the Forgetting Project, for instance, we also talked about if you should improve your memory to this high extent, because in the 90s it was a big topic that now with these big storage devices and the digital revolution, you could store basically everything, and then you have the perfect memory. Of course, you have a problem. If you don't forget, you get stuck. I mean, there are actually cases where doctors had to find techniques to relieve patients from these symptoms, that they could remember everything. And so this then came back in the interviews, and also like this immortality issue, you know, which is kind of an ingenious issue, you know. It's also very gender-based, because men feel much more attracted to this concept of immortality than women, probably because women can get children, and it's a different logic. And of course, as soon as you have children, you understand it very differently. And so these topics that I introduced, but also there is a very personal relation for me in, if I discuss with scientists, I'm really fascinated that their knowledge and how they talk seems to be based on facts. I mean, that's at least what is said. But of course, I mean, there is intuition as well. There are prejudice, there's cultural embeddedness, and it's, for me, it's a reflection on what I'm actually saying and working as an artist. You know, getting a comment from a natural scientist makes me understand better what we actually can do as artists, what they can't do, what we can talk about, what they can't talk about. You know, where they actually could learn something if they are open. But I mean, this goes both ways. You know, not many artists are open to the knowledge of natural scientists. But actually, it's a very interesting relation, because you have to question also things that you put on the table. You know, as an artist, you very often speak about spirituality. You know, and like Paulo Pereira, for instance, he asked me, "But what is spirituality?" You know, I have no idea. And then I was like, oh, well, okay. I mean, and he would like demolish all my arguments about spirituality, and he would even explain me why you have these concepts. If you die, you go into a light tunnel or things like this, because he told me that there is endorphin is like produced to a high extent when you die, and this causes this flash. You know, so you have a chemical description why you would think of the spiritual event. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, maybe I misheard the information about this, but how much time did you spend with those scientists, or maybe better, how long you've been working with them?
Yeah, thank you for the question, because I think that's really important. With Paulo Barreira, I was in contact for 7 years, and we developed projects. And in the Institute of Molecular Medicine, this was afterwards, I was still artist in residence 3 years. But this doesn't mean that I was on daily basis working with the scientists. Just, I think, if you seriously want to work in this area, you need some time to actually kind of get into it, first of all. Do not be just fascinated by these glossy surfaces and sexy machines and things like that, you know, because you go in the laboratory and think, wow, that's so cool, you know, shakers and everything, you know, and then you eventually find out, okay, that's the basic technology, the brush and things like that. And I really, afterwards it changed my perception very often on art pieces done on science, you know, because they look so creepy to me because they're so superficial. But I mean, it's unjust. Very often you don't have the possibility to get longer into contact with the scientists, also to get longer into the laboratories. And this is one of the main problems, because even I think the European European Commission that is in charge for the funding of science, they ask for interdisciplinary projects, you know, because they want to have, how do you say, the scientific work conveyed in a language that's understandable to the citizens, you know. So they would say, yeah, work together with artists and everything. But then if you look into these examples where artists are invited into labs, you know, it's totally asymmetric, you know. Very often you get some time where you can play in there. But the researchers, they don't have time to play with you. You know, you don't get proper funding that you actually could get involved in the work and probably also suggest other topics to investigate and things like that. So very often you are kind of decor. I mean, they use you. They say, "Wow, you're so open. We will let artists into our labs." But they don't take you serious very often. And I mean, there's also a hardcore fraction in the nature scientist community that would never write that they cooperated with artists in their CV, because this makes them totally ridiculous to their colleagues, and it's like the opposite, you know, like being proud of it. I think if you don't have the opportunity to get in a long-term exchange system with science, it's rather complicated to make any piece that's relevant or things like
that. I've read that your works are placed on different places. I wanted to ask, where do you prefer to exhibit your work? Rather in scientific facilities or museums, and where your impact on the public is closer to your desires?
It's a really good question, because at the beginning I thought, well, it would be really good to show it in also scientific institutions. But what I found out is, in scientific institutions, very often they do not have, first of all, the venues, like spaces, you know, where you could properly show artworks where there's some quiet area where people could actually have some concentration to see it, for instance. But then also they don't have formats to go there. I showed parts of the pieces that I did in the Institute of Molecular Medicine in the lobby of the Molecular Medicine Institute, and I was wondering why no one of the scientists who actually participated in the experiments would come and have a look at all the things that I did. You know, a few were there, but briefly, and then I found out that they could not stand around watching my stuff because all the colleagues would think that they are not doing anything. You know? They are lazy somehow. So you have to anticipate like all these circumstances that it's really complicated to show art in a scientific context. Of course, there's a science museum where it did shows, and also art museums or venues like the exhibition center in Vienna, where it depends. You know, I think it could go well in both venues, like the 4-channel installation piece was really working good in both contexts, but the other things were more appreciated actually in the art scene. They would understand my approach better than the scientists. But I mean, there's hardly any funding to do exhibitions in scientific venues. Also in the art market is kind of a marginal, very slim segment that you're working on. There are very few curators who are interested to deal with these artworks. But there's no general response. I mean, also I thought the piece that I did in the operation area in the hospital, you know, for me this was like paradise, that I could do it there. But what I understood is a hospital for doing contemporary art in a hospital is kind of really complicated, you know, because people don't like to go to hospitals, first of all. Then if they're there for treatment, you know, the least that they want to do is like getting into contemporary art because they are super stressed out. And that's also why you have these landscaping pictures on the hallways, like sunsets or shit like that, because they want a quiet environment. And then also the logistics, you know, to get people into a hospital as in the research facility is pretty very regulated, you know, you can't just bring anybody in. But of course that's the challenge. For me the project was wonderful, but in terms of the public there were very few people actually attending it.
How do scientists react when you want to cooperate with them? Are they mostly positive or negative feedbacks?
Well, I'm not sure if there's any general answer to it, you know, because I mean, first of all, most of the scientists I was working with were in the Department of Life Science, which might be a very specific part of the community. And in general, I think scientists do not have much time to play around, you know. I mean, there are a few people that are really interested in interdisciplinary work, so they also work with other colleagues in their field, but they are super occupied, you know. They are working with dedication. They are not like bureaucrats that go home at 5 in the afternoon. They even go to the laboratories during the weekend because they have to feed their cell cultures and things like that. And so I think it totally depends. You know, there are always like people that work in their area, but it's not enough. They want to do more, and you have to find these guys. You know, when you find these guys, then it's really fun because they also want to have something from you. But it's I don't know. I couldn't really say it, but probably it's 3% or 2%.
And how did you get to this topic? You wanted to be a scientist when you look it, or it was just a coincidence?
Well, I mean, what I wanted to suggest with the first works that I showed is that I had a general interest also in medicine and kind of the whole perception thing. And so perception is also triggered by science to a certain extent. You know, you can discuss it. And it was a coincidence that I got to know Paulo Pereira, who was in fact a scientist who was really interested in contemporary art and design before he met me. So eventually we met, and I mean, he suggested, and I asked him if I could enter his laboratory and understand more what he is doing. And he was like, really, yeah, come, no problem. And it was totally unbureaucratic, you know. It was in Portugal. There are also the restrictions are not as tough as in Austria, and he was not that high ranking, but already high ranking, so he could open the lab for me. And after some weeks there, you know, I was belonging to the lab. You know, I could go around freely in my own building and do things and ask people if they want to participate. It was pretty relaxed, but there is no clear technique how you approach it. Of course, in the Institute of Molecular Medicine, I had to go through a competition of artists who would actually compete for a grant for 1 year. And there was actually a lack of Portuguese artists that had any experience to work with scientists. And so eventually they made me Portuguese to get the grant and to do this. And this was very different because then I had an official contact with the communication unit in the institute, and she would introduce me to the colleagues. But it took, of course, some time until I really got close to some scientists. And the group leaders, they were more interested than people that are in the mid of their careers, where they have to work heavily on the benches in the labs. And do not also, the group leaders are very used to talk with people outside of the scientific area and politicians or something. They are very often doing interviews and stuff like that.
And have you ever got a very mean reaction from a scientist? Something like, oh, you stupid artist. Making fun of science and you know nothing else. And how you dealt with this situation, if you
obviously I'm not traumatized by it. I know that, actually one guy from Tübingen, on a conference in Berlin, he was like really pissed off by referenceless photography. He said that this is not okay to do like that, and that this is like turning the Mickey out of them. But I mean, the weird thing was that we actually asked the scientists for authorization to publish their comments on referenceless photography, and I think it was not hostile, but most people might get in this direction. The funny thing is that afterwards, this scientist who was really good about referenceless photography got friends with me, and we were like discussing various topics, and so they don't take art very serious, one has to say. So they are also not very affected if you are kind of playing with them, because they think, okay, that's artistic play. So I think it would be different if this goes on a very high level of society, where there's a serious discussion. That's the asymmetry also in the projects, that you hardly have a voice to say, no, I think that's really, that's spooky, if you revert self-differentiation and there is not a very clear international guideline in which cases you might do it or not. I think you should not do it. You should not get funds for it or things like that. It's not the artist that can say that. But I mean, it's still, as for me, it was kind of an achievement that I got this piece that is one working connector between molecular medicine and civil society. But it's a tiny thing. many of the scientists, of course this is an assumption now, but they have a good humor actually. I really like it. And also then on the personal level they feel it, that you're respectful. And I mean what I always like is that they are dedicated. I mean they really work, not for the money, but they work because they are interested in what they're doing, and so that there's a connection usually.
You started about funding. Is it hard to get some money for experimenting in this way?
Well, I mean, I think getting funding as an artist in general is hard. So actually you have to invent your profession and your funding at a certain degree anyway. The misunderstanding on my side was that I thought that science has so big funds, they have like really huge project money, that it might be not complicated to dedicate a certain little small amount to art. But this turned out to be a total misunderstanding. I never received any money from the scientific project. There is some money for scientific communication. So like this interface to the civil society, there you might get funding, but they usually want you to communicate science as a marketing thing. You should say, wow, science is so cool and so great. And it's very hard to actually do an independent art project with them. What is specific in Austria now is that since quite some time, art and science is a topic. It's important, and there are fundings from the government and the University of Applied Arts is especially interested in interdisciplinary research, and so this makes my life easier right now. But it's not. I mean, you hardly can enter the art market with this work, because they say you can't sell it. I mean, I don't think it's true actually. It depends on the level you have. You might also sell this, but there is not. You have less competitors because there are very few people working in this area. And I mean, of course, there's a whole community that, especially bioarts is a category where you work with living tissue. So there's a whole community of artists and curators that tour around the world with their bioart shows. But they would not accept my work, for instance. So again, in between.
It's more of a social experiment.
Yeah, it's more cultural studies and things like that. And I think actually the means are quite based in fine arts. I mean, it was for me surprising that in Vienna, when I had the big show, I had 8 rooms filled with my installation work. The curators that I knew from 20 years before, but they did not follow my work, they could really read the installation and the language and everything. So then I understood, okay, it's not so cryptic as many people say.
Do you teach now in Vienna Art Academy? Is that true?
Yeah.
And in which department?
Social design. It's a new department that is 3 years. And second title is Arts as Urban Innovation. And it deals with transformation of the urban space. Also how art can be used as a mean to connect communities in the city and find solutions for gentrification processes and things like that are not cannot be solved with city planning, architecture, things like that. And I mean, my field of expertise is visual arts. There are also architects and performers and other fields of expertise. It's really interesting. It's an international group of students coming from everywhere from the world. But it's young. It's like a construction site. No one exactly knows what it is. It's really nice. So, what are you doing? Are you all artists? No, probably not. Or are you?
Not yet.
Not yet. But are you studying art? All of you?
Art education.
Art education. And do you want to make a living as teachers? Or I used to study art education, but I never finished my studies. I mean, I studied it extensively, actually 8 years.
Because it sounds optimistic that someone studied art education and then become an artist.
Well, I mean, the thing is, I was like, I really wanted to do this teaching job, you know, but then after going through the academy in Vienna and also like getting into exhibition projects, suddenly it was for me so stupid to go back to school and teach because there was an exhibition. But I mean, it's very different, of course. You're going into the institution, you're institutionalized to a certain extent. And I actually met some colleagues also that studied with me that are now in the department on the University of Applied Arts. They never went out of the university. They were teaching also in a high school. And then their perception of the world is totally different. I was like, I just went back to the university 1 year ago. So I had like 25 years without any institutional contact. And I think that's the thing. I think it's hard to actually teach and be artist at the same time, for me at least, because you have to create the technique how you make your money and how you produce your projects apart from the salary that you get on a monthly basis. Otherwise you will never find out how this could work. You know?
Thank you.